Last time, Isaac, the son first promised to Abraham and Sarah long before was born. God then tested Abraham's faith after some years had gone by telling him to sacrifice Isaac, who was now a young man. Abraham believed and obeyed God, and they set out on their journey, eventually arriving at the mountain of Moriah, where Isaac was bound and laid on the altar. With the knife about to descend, God called out, stopped Abraham, and told him that a ram had been provided as a sacrifice in Isaac's place. So now we pick up the thread of the narrative when Isaac is 40 years old. This is in Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 20. He has just married a young woman named Rebekah. Abraham, unwilling for Isaac to marry a local Canaanite woman, has sent back to his Mesopotamian homeland for a wife to be found among his extended family line there. And the account records Abraham's death and the fact that Isaac became the one to whom God had entrusted his promises for that generation. He was to receive the blessing, the special position given by God in those days to the patriarchal ancestor of his chosen people. This is the line through which the promised one would come. This special place, originally held by Abraham and now by Isaac, included with it assurances of God's special protection and his favor. It also came with the right to a double portion of the inheritance and to be the head of the family group. Rebekah was unable to have children, but after Isaac pleads with the Lord on her behalf, she becomes pregnant. We're given a few brief but fascinating details related to the pregnancy, which proves to be a difficult one. This is in Genesis 25, verses 21 to 23. Concerned, Rebekah asks the Lord what's happening to her. He explains that she is to have twins and that what she's feeling is a prenatal rehearsal of the conflict that will exist between her two sons in life. They are to be the progenitors of two rival nations. Once again, God's straightforward narrative of events reveals important underlying truths and offers tantalizing clues that draw us on to find out more. Although most of the human players so far have been men, we see the relationship Rebekah has with the Lord. It's also worth noting that God is entirely familiar with her two sons and their futures before they're born. In passing too, we should register the fact that already in the narrative, God has placed great importance on nations and peoples, on language groups and family lines. Clearly, he relates to people as individuals, but he also deals with them collectively as groups. We'll talk about that more later. So Rebekah gave birth to the twins, but they were certainly not identical, either physically or in character. This is described in Genesis 25, verses 24 to 28. You can read those yourself. Esau, Isaac's favorite, the firstborn, and therefore with the rights to the blessings and inheritance that come with that position, he would grow up to be a hairy, rough, impetuous individual, uncomfortable indoors, a hunter. His brother, Jacob, is described in the text as having a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. This is in Genesis 25, verses 27 to 28. It also adds that his mother, Rebekah, particularly loved him. An account is given in Genesis 25, verses 29 to 34, of an event which would have enormous consequences for them personally, but also in the wider scope of the narrative. Esau arrives home one day, no doubt from a hunting trip. He's tired and ravenously hungry, and he demands some of the stew his brother has cooked. Jacob sees an opportunity. He gets Esau to swear his birthright over to him in exchange for the food. The text comments that this showed Esau's contempts for his rights as firstborn. This is in Genesis 25, verse 34. Certainly the choice to swap his birthright seems silly and impetuous. And we can see that it was foolish in terms of the material inheritance he had now jeopardized. But was this more than just a bad choice made in a moment of weakness? Later, God's word would describe him, Esau, as immoral and godless. But why was this reputation deserved? As we've noted before, God graciously offers genuine responsibilities to human beings who walk humbly in dependence on him. But Esau was indifferent to this amazing opportunity. He placed no value on the God-given role of being guardian of the promises as the family head. And he was also demonstrating a complete lack of interest in the promised one, for whom God had chosen that family line, an eventual nation through which he, the promised one, would come. Like Cain and numerous others not identified in the narrative, like millions of people today, he was preoccupied with his own felt needs and materialistic interests and was unaware or unwilling to acknowledge his desperate need to see his sin debt paid for. Jacob, it turns out, was completely different. We might question his tactics, but clearly he hugely valued the firstborn birthrights. As comes out in the next parts of the narrative, Jacob did recognize his need before God. He humbly approached God on God's terms, sacrificing innocent animals in recognition of the death separation that his own sin deserved. And we can safely assume, looking forward with keen anticipation for the arrival of the promised deliverer. There is certainly indication later in the biblical narrative that God, knowing what these two men would be like, had chosen Jacob for the special position of leading the family line in being the caretaker of the promises, and so had chosen him for the enormous privilege of being an ancestor of the promised deliverer. Later, Jacob, with Rebekah's complicity, tricks the now aged and blind Isaac, his father, into thinking that he is Esau. His father gives him the verbal blessing and binding confirmation that he will inherit the firstborn rights. Esau, who, as we've noted, was indifferent to the spiritual aspects of the position, is furious at the loss of inheritance this represents. And the text says that from that time on, Esau hates Jacob and decides that he will find a way to kill him as soon as their father's dead. When their mother, Rebekah, hears about his plan, she organizes for Jacob to escape and to stay away until Esau's anger has time to cool off. You can read this account for yourself in Genesis chapter 27, verses 41 to 44. So Isaac sets out on the journey of many days north and then east from Canaan to Haran, the trade city where Abraham and his group had lived for a time, if you remember, on their family migration from Ur, and also where his father, Terah, had died. It was also Rebekah's home area. Jacob has his famous dream while sleeping outside one night on this trip. It's described in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 16. A staircase reaches from earth to heaven, with God's messengers going up and down. By showing this to Jacob and having the incident recorded in his narrative, God was giving a powerful illustration, or a metaphor, if you like, for what the deliverer would do when he came. Through the rebellion of Adam, head of the human race, the relationship between God and man, between heaven and earth, as it were, has been severed. The way God had provided for people to approach him through the sacrifices was always meant to be a stopgap measure. Satan, death, and sin still rule the earth and its inhabitants. And this had created an enormous obstacle to the permanent access between God and man that God so desires. The sacrifices provided a temporary way around, but didn't deal with the problem. That's what he would send the deliverer for, to provide a permanent avenue for free, unrestricted interchange between God and man, between heaven and earth. God spoke to Jacob in the dream, reaffirming the promises he had made to his grandfather Abraham and to his father Isaac. Jacob completes his journey to the lands of his relatives in northern Mesopotamia, where he lived, as it turns out, for some 20 years. During that time, he marries two sisters, Leah and Rachel. He has 11 sons, the last, Benjamin, being born after their eventual return to Canaan. During the trip back, God gave Jacob a new name, Israel, and he settled in Canaan again. And in time, the growing family, then later the nation that did and continues to have such a large part in God's story, that nation would bear his name.